Hello, fifth graders, and welcome to Language Arts for today. Before we get started, you will certainly need your copy of Gilgamesh. And then paper and pencil, and paper could be your language arts notebook. These are optional, but again, I would ask you to think about how your homework has gone for the last couple of days. If you've been doing well and using paper and pencil, you should keep doing that. If you've been doing fine without them, that's also okay. But if you've been struggling with your homework and not really doing great and you haven't been using paper and pencil, then I would encourage you to go get those things so that you can see if that will help. So pause if you need to go get those things and then come on back. The first thing we're going to do today, fifth graders, is talk briefly about your homework, chapter 3. So question 1 asks, who is Hawawa? You should have checked that he is the monster who protects the cedar forests and who causes one's strength to ebb away. This should have been on page 21 in your text. What does Gilgamesh say is the purpose of living? There were quite a few quotes that you could have selected, but he says, to make a mark on the world, this is on page 22, or to blaze a trail through it, or to do deeds worthy of remembrance. All of those would be great answers for what Gilgamesh says is the purpose of living. Remember, you should be using as many words from the question in your answer as possible. So today actually is the day that I'm going to start returning homework and asking you to fix it if you have not used as many words as possible. So going into today's homework, I hope you're really thinking about this. Number 3, what did the elders tell Gilgamesh? They told him to reconsider his journey. They did not want him to be going on this journey. This is on page 23. And how did he respond? Gilgamesh responded to the elders by only laughing. Again, on page 23. Fifth graders, there were so many great quotes that you guys selected revealing hubris in this chapter. Then I would have killed him already is a great one. The fact that Gilgamesh just laughed at the elders when Enkidu warns him about going into the cedar forest and Gilgamesh walks by whistling. All of these things are great examples of hubris, and there are more than the ones that I've just read, but a lot. And again, we say maybe, might be evidence of hubris because, again, hubris requires a downfall. And at this point, we don't necessarily know whether or not Gilgamesh will have a downfall. I saw a lot of great sentences using this word candidly. So remember that you want to make sure you're following these vocabulary sentence expectations, which means it needs to be at least 6 words long. And you need to show me that you understand the word, the definition of the word, okay? So there needs to be enough in there that I say, oh yeah, that makes sense. Some of you have been really doing outstanding vocabulary sentences, and I'm really impressed. Others of you have been encouraging you to see if you can dig a little deeper as you're trying to convey to me the definitions of these words, okay? So for today, chapter 4, same expectations. We're starting off with these short answer questions. So remember, using as many words from the question in your answer as possible. What is one thing that Gilgamesh would rather do than marry Ishtar? So again, you'd say one thing that Gilgamesh would rather do than marry Ishtar is. What is one quote that hinted that the bull of heaven was approaching Uruk? One quote that hinted that the bull of heaven was approaching Uruk was. What is one mood that is conveyed on pages 39 through 40? One mood that is conveyed on pages 39 through 40 is. What is one quote that supports that mood? So whatever you picked for 3, you want to pick a quote to support that mood. One quote that supports that mood is. As you're looking at these pages, fifth graders, there's actually kind of 2 conflicting moods going on. And they're in contrast with one another. So you really could go one way or a totally different direction based on what you're picking, okay? There's really 2 disparate moods happening. Number 5 asks, why does Gilgamesh believe that his everlasting fame will be ensured? Chapter 6, what does Enkidu's dream foreshadow? Remember that literary device, foreshadowing. And then finally, which of the following correctly uses the word devout? And remember that I'm defining vocabulary for you in your instructions. So fifth graders, as we take a look at our objective is relating directly to questions 3 and 4. Okay, we're working on identifying mood and textual evidence to support that mood. So fifth graders, we are going to get into reading chapter 4 together. Remember, as I am reading, you should be reading along with me. That is your expectation, that you follow along. That is what's going to help your reading improve, is your eyes are following the words that are coming out. And then I'm going to be stopping to talk about these periodically, these questions or these pages as we read along. Okay, so we are on chapter 4, page 31, Marry Me. If you need to pause, do so, but I'm going to get started. Gilgamesh, Gilgamesh, how well you look in my temple of love. Gilgamesh spun round. Through the perfumed smoke of the temple came a woman astounding in every way, swaying her hips, lifting her hair from the nape of her neck with both wrists. That hair, it spilled down like wine overbrimming a beaker. There's a simile, spilled down like wine. From the crown of her head to the soles of her feet. It was Ishtar, goddess of love. Enkidu's heart sank, for he could see that Ishtar was in love. She would twine her slender brown arms around Gilgamesh, and Enkidu's newfound friend would be lost to him. For who could resist the goddess of love? He crept away into the daylight. Gilgamesh, said Ishtar, killing Hawawa was a feat worthy of a god. My heart was in my mouth as you fought. Now it is in my hands. Think, Gilgamesh, if I were to give that heart to you, think! I would make you a chariot of lapis with golden wheels. Kings and princes would lie like carpet under your feet. I could give you storm demons to pull your wagons. Nothing less will do for a husband of mine. She brought her face close up against his. Her breath smelt of nutmeg and roses. I love you, King of Uruk. Marry me. Gilgamesh breathed her in. The perfume made him dizzy. Then, resting his hand on her upper arms, he said, I'll pay you all the prayers and sacrifices a devout man ought to pay to a goddess. I always have, and I always will. But as for marrying you, he sucked the air in through his teeth. Not for all the honey in the hive, lady. And he stood her away from him as if he were sliding a chair back under a table. Ishtar's jaw dropped. A tendril of hair found its way into her mouth and she spat it out again, blinking, astounded. I'm flattered you should woo me, Gilgamesh went on. But frankly, I'd rather play dice with a handful of scorpions. I've heard about the men that you've loved in the past, and I've heard what became of them once you lost interest. Being loved by you is rather like being struck by masonry falling off a high building, isn't it? Walking round and round her, he counted off on his fingers all the young men who had ever caught the eye of Ishtar. Remind me, what became of your husband, Tammuz? Such a devoted lover. When your sister was holding you prisoner in the underworld, who took your place? Tammuz, the only person fool enough to spend eternity in the dark, so that his true love could live in the sunlight. Take that shepherd, remember? The one who brought you mealy cakes and roasted his fluffy little kids, again baby goats, for your supper? Played flute tunes to you on a bone whistle. He thought he was the happiest man alive, till you tired of him and turned him into a wolf. Where is he these days? Still carrying his tail between his legs, still howling at the moon? And didn't you love the king of the lions once? The one who died in those traps you dug for him? And that horse that took your fancy, spurs and a whip, that was his reward in the end. You rode him 7 leagues with spurs and a whip, and then let him slake his thirst in muddy water. Take that bird who sang for you, the one with the multicolored plumes. When you tired of him, you smashed him like a ball with a racket, and now he sits on a branch and weeps. My wing, my poor broken wing. Ishtar opened and shut her mouth, but no words came out. Oh, and that gardener who tended your father's date palms, does he enjoy being a mole, would you think? The trouble with you, madam, is that you start by kissing and end by cursing. I know you, lady, and I'd sooner wear tight shoes for the rest of my life than be married to you. And with a laugh which set all the candle flames quivering, Gilgamesh dodged her clawing fingernails, skipped out into the clean white sunlight, and ran to find Enkidu. So we already have seen two possible answers for question one, and we can see the reactions that Ishtar is having. Somewhere between total shock and anger, right? We see that she continues to kind of open her mouth in this, how dare he talk to me this way? And there's no words coming out. But also we hear about her clawing fingernails, or that the hair that gets stuck in her mouth, she spits it out. So there's that anger too. But Gilgamesh keeps listing person after person that she's loved and then treated horribly afterwards. So he says, no, thank you, right? Not for all the honey in the hive, lady. So you'll want to find one of the two things he says he'd rather do than marry Ishtar. Ishtar gave a gasping roar. Ugh! She beat her fists against the walls. Ugh! She stamped and flung herself about in an ecstasy of rage. Ah! She ran all the way to heaven and threw herself down at her father's feet, weeping bitterly. It's Gilgamesh, she sobbed. Destroy him. Let me destroy him. He has insulted me. Anu fingered his beard. How? What did he say? He listed all my lovers and what I had done to them. Anu said, and? Did he slander you? Was it untrue? He called me a... Anu leaned forwards expectantly. Yes, what did he call you? Falling masonry, a pair of tight shoes. Why are you laughing? Never mind what he called me, the wretch, the vile, beastly, wicked, blaspheming nobody. He must be destroyed. Give me the bull of heaven to destroy Gilgamesh and his famous city of streets. He slaughtered Hawawa, and now he has slighted me. Anu's amusement turned to dismay. So amusement means that he was kind of entertained by this whole thing because someone had accurately described his daughter. So he's kind of like, well, yeah, all the things he said about you are true. So he's amused by it and that she's mad. Okay, but then it turns to dismay, which means that he's very worried, very concerned, very upset. So turned to dismay at the news of Hawawa's death. Here was a serious affront to Mighty Enlil, who had created the guardian of the cedar forests. Gilgamesh should not have pitted himself against the gods in such a way. Then loose the bull of heaven and destroy him, cried Ishtar. You know what you are asking, Ishtar. If I loose the bull of heaven, it will be 7 years before Uruk recovers. Famine and drought, destruction. Have you thought of the innocent people who may die? Ishtar wagged a dismissive hand. Yes, yes, the granaries are full. The people won't suffer. But Gilgamesh must. I demand that Gilgamesh pay for what he said. Well, her tears splashed like hot lead on the pavements of heaven. Another simile. Anu looked at his daughter. Anger made her ugly, as it makes all faces ugly. Her man's beard came bristling through the skin of her jaw. Her teeth were bared, her eyes bloodshot with shouting. It was plain there would be no peace until Ishtar got her way. Not the bull of heaven, daughter. Choose some lesser punishment. If you don't give me what I want, hissed Ishtar, her voice so menacing that even Anu shivered. I shall go now and smash the bolts on the gates of the underworld. I shall loose all the souls of the dead. Ishtar! Up they will come, shrieking and gibbering out of the ground, jostling shoulders with the living. Not one will quite know whether the man beside him is a ghost or if the bride behind the veil has been dead since the flood. Wait until the dead become hungry and begin to eat. Anu shuddered in disgust. Stop, Ishtar. The dead loosed from the underworld to eat the living. Ishtar, enough! Well, I shall loose the bull of heaven, daughter, but it grieves me that a man should be punished simply for speaking the truth. In the city of Uruk, so this is another one of those symbols that says we're kind of shifting to different directions. In the city of Uruk, red dust trickled from the sandstone buildings, and all the dogs began to bark. Cockerels crowed in the middle of the night, and dates fell from the palm trees in fat, black splats. The city of streets was feeling the approach of the bull of heaven. That last sentence should be a hint about one of your questions. Then everyone in Uruk was awake and running, yelling and pointing out over the plain. The goddess Ishtar was coming out of the dawn, leading the bull of heaven, and no one had seen such a sight in the history of the world. But from the parapets of the city wall, Gilgamesh and Enkidu watched. The bull was as big as a herd of elephants within one hide. Its great dew-lapped throat swept the ground, and its horns spread like twin waterspouts catching the light. Plated in lapis lazuli, their shining blue bow was as huge as the prow and stern of a ship. Ishtar led it to the far bank of the river. How women do hate to be spurned, said Enkidu softly. He could smell the sweat in his friend's palms. Smell his own fear come to that. Here was destruction made flesh. So we get hints there that both Enkidu and Gilgamesh are nervous, right? Enkidu's feeling his own fear. It says he can smell it, and it says he can smell Gilgamesh's sweaty palms, which means that Gilgamesh is sweating from nervousness. Then it stamped, and there was no more thinking. The bull stamped, and the earth simply opened up. Acres of ground subsided into a bottomless crevasse, and with it 100 young men. So citizens of Uruk are falling into this open crevasse in the earth. Again, the bull pawed the ground head down, the ugly hump of its back quaking. Within the city, the granaries fractured like stone eggs spilling grain. Carved friezes crazed and fell in shards. Towers swayed and crumbled into dust, and a twin-forked, jagged chasm yawned in the ground, swallowing up 200 warriors of Uruk. The river Euphrates cascaded down into darkness. A single scream of terror hung in the air. It had the color of red dust and settled on Gilgamesh like blood. At the third stamp, the very walls of Uruk wavered like sheets of water. Enkidu was jarred off his feet and struck his head against the parapet. Pain paralyzed him. It seemed to sing through his skull and unstring his spine. But he was on his feet again. Quick, before it can charge the city gate! Launching himself off the high wall, Enkidu landed between the very horns of the bull, grasping them like the shafts of a cart. The foam of its nostrils burst into his face, blinding him. Gilgamesh leapt down as well, sword drawn. Well, friend, didn't we say we would make a name for ourselves? Called Enkidu. Strike behind the horns if you can. Bucking, stiff-legged, turning and turning on the spot, the bull of heaven lashed Enkidu with its thick, hairy cable of a tail and sent him sprawling along its back. But Gilgamesh was there to vault over the nose and take hold of the horns in Enkidu's place, to wrench them round until the beast was brought to a standstill. Enkidu, meanwhile, slithered over the bull's rump, grabbing the tail as he went, pulling it like a bell rope, hanging on even when the dust from under its iron hooves enveloped him in gritty darkness. Digging in with his heels, he hauled on the tail, quick, wrenching tugs which took its attention away from the flimsy gate, away from Gilgamesh straddling its neck. There was a flash of light, a hiss, and a thud, and the blade of Gilgamesh's sword drove home right up to its hilt in the arc of the bull's neck, just between the nape and the horns. For long seconds, the bull held still, the foam dripping from its nostrils into a sudsy pool between its feet. Then it staggered sideways, crashed against the walls of Uruk, lurched the other way. It stumbled as far as the river before falling into what little water was left, turning it blood red. So right now I'm thinking that earlier Anu, one of the gods, was expressing that Gilgamesh should not have killed Huwawa, that was an affront to the gods, and the bull of heaven was sent as a punishment. And now Gilgamesh and Enkidu have killed the bull of heaven. So I have this question about how the gods are going to respond to this. Enkidu sat on the ground holding his head, and Hattie, the dancing girl, ran towards him, asking, was he hurt? Could she help? Up on the wall, a wall crazed now with jagged cracks, Ishtar, the goddess of love, let out a howl of pure hatred. Tears burst through her tightly shut lids, making runnels in the red dust which had painted her the color of rage. See how they have butchered the lovely bull of heaven. Weep, women, weep at what they have done. We are now in the pages, fifth graders, where you should really start paying attention to mood. And the women did begin weeping, not for the carcass lying in the river's mud, perhaps, but for the 300 young men swallowed up by the earth, for the empty river, for the spoiled beauty of the city. Enkidu was disgusted. He twisted off the bull's back leg and shied it at Ishtar, as he might at a cat yowling on a wall. If I could get my hands on you, I'd show you butchery. Gilgamesh stood on the body of the great bull. See the horns plated in lapis. I shall fill them with oil and offer the oil to my guardian gods. Then I shall hang them on the wall of my palace to remind me how I slew the bull of heaven. And the men, happy to be alive, cheered and carried Gilgamesh and Enkidu shoulder high into the battered city. Through streets strewn with rubble, past broken pillars and burning buildings, they carried Gilgamesh. He felt his everlasting fame ensured. Who fought the bull of heaven? He shouted, and the clamoring little boys shouted back, Gilgamesh, Gilgamesh. Who killed the bull of heaven? He called out to a group of dancing girls, watching the mob tumble by. The girls eyed one another uncertainly, lids still red with weeping. Then Hattie, the friend of Enkidu, stepped out of the shade into the sunlight. Gilgamesh and Enkidu, she called in her high singing voice. After that, the girls too were running alongside, whooping and chanting, Gilgamesh, Enkidu, Gilgamesh, Enkidu. Only the mothers and old women stood in their doorways, shawls drawn tight under their chins, silent. And high on her tower, Ishtar, alone and disregarded, chewed on her plait of hair and cursed Gilgamesh under her breath. Death to Gilgamesh and Enkidu, a curse on their friendship and on their happiness, justice on their mortal heads. So again, I kind of was talking about how the moods seem to be in conflict. There's kind of two different things happening. So I'm only asking you to pick one of them for tonight's homework, but thinking about how this is like a very uncomfortable tension of what one group seems to be feeling and what another group seems to be feeling, and that they really are in conflict with one another. We also see as Ishtar is stewing in her rage and her anger that perhaps this might be an example of foreshadowing. So again, this symbol tells us we're kind of switching gears. We're away from this chanting and have moved on a little bit later. Enkidu's head ached where it had slammed against the wall. Throughout the celebrations, he felt a little sick. That night, he slept a sleep of utter exhaustion. And to the beating of the drums in his head, he dreamed a dream. The gods were gathered in conference. Anu, the father of gods, was there. So too was Enlil, god of heroes. Ea, the maker of mankind. Nergal of the underworld. Ninurta, god of war. A small patch of brightness which pained Enkidu too much to look at, he took to be Shamash, the sun. The gods stood shoulder to shoulder in a ring, their heads close together. My daughter is right, Anu was saying. Someone must pay. And yet they fought well. No warrior ever fought better, said Ninurta. I would take two, but I will settle for one, said Nergal. Shut out by the circle of backs, Enkidu found it hard to hear. Apparently some crime had been committed. Shamash was speaking now. It was Gilgamesh who killed Huwawa. But it was Enkidu who cut down the tallest tree. As in all the worst dreams, Enkidu tried to speak, tried to put his side of the argument, but his hands would not lift and there was no breath in his lungs. His shouts only emerged in whimpers. Maybe you've had that experience when you're dreaming a dream and you're trying desperately to speak, but no words come out. Shamash was saying, were they not, in a way, honoring us by these heroic deeds? Enlil rounded on Shamash. The bull of heaven has been killed. Law demands the death penalty. It is simply a matter of deciding who shall die. Gilgamesh or Enkidu. Gilgamesh or Enkidu. Gilgamesh or Enkidu. Gilgamesh or... He woke with the name of his friend on his lips. Gilgamesh or... He was wet with sweat and shivering. He had to go and tell Gilgamesh to warn him. Dreams were not just the rotting vegetation of the past, the leaves blown down from the day before. Dreams were omens. Dreams were messages. Maybe even foreshadowing. He slipped his legs off the bed and tried to stand up, but the roaring inside his head was like the bull of heaven bellowing. He covered his eyes, but the light still seared through to his brain. Sweat crawled down his body like a swarm of beetles, and his guts ached. Gilgamesh, he tried to call, but his own name emerged instead. Enkidu. Enkidu must die. So, fifth graders, you have some questions to answer. They're a lot related to our literary devices. Remember, with short answers, as many words from the question in your answer as possible. I'm excited to see what you guys come up with. Good luck.